Hello. Donald Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, has spoken candidly to Congress about what his job entailed. In his testimony, he called Trump a racist and spoke at length about his suspicions over his former boss's connections to Russia before and during the 2016 election campaign. Cohen also apologized for some of his behavior while in Trump's employment.
I am ashamed that I chose to take part in concealing Mr. Trump's illicit acts rather than listening to my own conscience. I am ashamed because I know what Mr. Trump is. He is a racist, he is a con man, and he is a cheat. He was a presidential candidate who knew that Roger Stone was talking with Julian Assange about a WikiLeaks drop on Democratic National Committee emails.
Let's speak to Steve Clemons. He's the Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for speaking to us. So that congressional hearing still going on. From what you've heard so far, Steve Clemons, what's the most damaging? What's the most explosive?
Well, right now, the most damaging thing in this nail-biting hearing, we haven't seen a hearing like this really since Watergate that implicated directly the President of the United States in criminal activity. But the zinger of this was really getting the revelations about personal checks that the President of the United States signed while president as part of a hush money scheme to silence a woman who was going to disclose issues about their relationship just days before the last 2016 election. Of all the things, and there's a lot of color, there's a lot of context, and there's a lot of tension, but that alone is potentially the thing that could really undermine the president and cause incredible legal problems for him.
What about what Michael Cohen had to say on WikiLeaks? He said that Trump knew in advance from Roger Stone about the WikiLeaks drop of email to damage the Hillary Clinton campaign at the time in 2016. What is the significance of that?
Well, what I would say is it's highly significant. Everything we're hearing is highly significant. Even the kind of color and context that the president may have been told by his son that the famed Russia meeting in Trump Tower was there. But there's a difference, I think, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, in being aware that WikiLeaks was going to do something, of being passive and acknowledging it and knowing it, even though he denied any such knowledge in the past. So certainly there's jeopardy for the president in that. But I sort of see a pathway that Republicans can say, you know, he was passive in this. He didn't ask WikiLeaks to do this. There's no evidence of necessary collusion, that collusion remains different than awareness. And one of the things that really struck out to me is that Michael Cohen resisted actually calling what the president did outright collusion. And
some Democrats throwing around the word impeachment right now. Does this hearing actually step up the possibility of opening up at least impeachment proceedings against the president? I think the Democratic caucus is very divided. I think there certainly is a substantial portion of the caucus that says the kind of criminality over campaign finance fraud at a level, an industrial level, in the kind of hush money scheme they have would be enough for many. That the Russia piece of this may not be necessary. But the notion about WikiLeaks, the other kinds of things that may have been discussed yesterday in closed hearings about Russia before the Intelligence Committee, that there may be material there. But I don't sense yet, I spent a lot of time with members of Congress in both parties, I don't sense that on the House side that the appetite is fully there yet, that a tipping point has been achieved, knowing that they're on solid ground to pursue impeachment hearings. But all of this adds to that, and it could go there. But I think it's too early to say it will go there. What about Cohen himself and his testimony? We saw he was attacked by some Republicans questioning his credibility, and we know that he's convicted of lying to Congress, meant to start his jail sentence in May. How did he come across to you? I think he came off as steady, sober. He was not thrown off his game by some very derogatory statements about himself from Republican members. The Republicans, some of them
really didn't ask questions. They just reminded people of the mistruths that Michael Cohen spoke before. And, you know, in one case, Mark Meadows, who's part of the Freedom Caucus, brought an African-American woman who had worked for the Trump organization and said, look, she works there, she's black. She is, in her own way, evidence that Donald Trump must not be racist. That kind of thing of trying to pick apart the credibility and the solvency as a witness of Michael Cohen has been there. But it's been interesting to me that not a single Republican interlocutor has actually tried to drill down into the substance of what Cohen has provided about the president's payment of these checks, of the president's efforts around a famous portrait that he bought using his foundation and engaged in potentially criminal activity there, that none of those data points came up. It's all about Michael Cohen's character.
All right, Steve Clemons, we thank you for speaking to us from Washington.
Thank you.
Well, this is what Michael Cohen said about the negotiations for a Trump Tower Moscow. That's a project the president has repeatedly distanced himself from.
The last time I appeared before Congress, I came to protect Mr. Trump. Today, I am here to tell the truth about Mr. Trump. I lied to Congress when Mr. Trump stopped negotiating the Moscow Tower project in Russia. I stated that we stopped negotiating in January of 2016. That was false. Our negotiations continued for months later during the campaign. Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. In conversations we had during the campaign, at the same time I was actively negotiating in Russia for him, he would look me in the eye and tell me there's no Russian business, and then go on to lie to the American people by saying the same thing. In his way, he was telling me to lie.
Shihab Rattansi is joining us from Washington. And specifically on that point, Shihab, on the Trump Tower project, not only did he talk about what the president had said about it, but he also said that the entire family, the entire Trump family, could have been compromised as well by Russia.
Right. Well, I mean, they were all sort of involved. And I think that this particular thread of the testimony is interesting for several levels, because there was an allegation in a BuzzFeed news report that Donald Trump had lent on Michael Cohen to lie to Congress. Cohen is saying, no, there wasn't any direct instruction to lie to Congress. There was this indirect understanding that Donald Trump had with Michael Cohen that you know, there was no business happening in Russia. However, Donald Trump's personal lawyers had seen the congressional testimony that Cohen was about to give, which did lie about the Russian negotiations. So that could be a legal issue eventually somewhere. But it's also interesting, well, I'll get to the family in a second, but it's also interesting because of the extra bit of color we had about why Donald Trump was lying. Cohen is saying that Donald Trump lied throughout the campaign about his dealings with Russia. He kept saying, look, we have no business dealings with Russia. However, he was very interested in the development of this Trump Tower in Moscow. And what Cohen was saying there was, Trump was lying to the American people about the ongoing negotiations. But the reason he was lying was he didn't really ever expect to be caught in any kind of lie, because he never expected to be president in the first place. And in another part of the testimony, Cohen says Donald Trump had no intention of ever becoming president. He just thought of this as the greatest infomercial ever to build up his brand. And that brand is all about putting your name on towers around the world. So the implication is he was running for president in part to increase the cachet of a Trump Tower wherever it might be, perhaps in Moscow. So that was quite fascinating. But yes, throughout this, there has been these questions about, all right, well, what about the rest of the family? And I would say, even though we haven't really heard anything we didn't already know, we knew Trump was directly implicated in the campaign finance violations. Perhaps we've heard some new stuff about tax and the Trump Foundation. This idea that Donald Trump Jr. was implicated in the campaign finance violations is new, and he must be a bit worried now. And certainly we're hearing members of Congress, they're asking about other members of the family. Did they know about Russia? Did they know? And they're not really getting the answers they want. At least the Democrats aren't getting the answers they want. But they will, certainly when it comes to the Trump Foundation and the campaign finance allegations, members of the Trump family may be a little bit uneasy right now.
And Shihab, just put this into context for us, especially when it comes to the Robert Mueller investigation currently ongoing.
Well, so this was the big surprise of the testimony, that Russia would even come up. We had been told before that Russia wouldn't be coming up because Elijah Cummins, the chair, didn't want to step on the toes of other investigations in Congress or elsewhere. Michael Cohen is now saying various things, for example, about that WikiLeaks dump that you mentioned, that Trump knew about, or had been told by Roger Stone, this lobbyist with a rather checkered record, that he'd had a conversation with Assange, Julian Assange, and had been informed personally that a dump was coming. WikiLeaks denies that any conversation ever took place. They said, actually, we announced it publicly. You can look at The Guardian in that same month where they say, look, we're going to be coming out with this dump, and that Roger Stone is just a man who shouldn't be trusted. It all depends now on what Donald Trump told Robert Mueller then. If Robert Mueller was told by Donald Trump, I didn't know anything about any WikiLeaks dump, whether it was because Roger Stone had read it in the papers or he had a conversation with Assange, well, that could be trouble for Donald Trump, because Donald Trump then would have said something that someone else is saying wasn't true. Michael Cohen is saying he heard Donald Trump being informed about that dump. So it's all about that now. It's about what Donald Trump told Robert Mueller, whether that coincides with what Michael Cohen is saying about his own recollections, and whether Robert Mueller believes Michael Cohen or Donald Trump. So this is where the Mueller part of this comes in there. It's about whether Michael Cohen and Donald Trump's accounts of what was going on at that point, whether they actually coincide, which apparently they might not do, or they might do, and who Robert Mueller believes.
Okay, Shihab Britansi, thank you.